Thank you for being here with me. I see we are working just fine today, which is awesome. The platform has been quite a journey, and here we are. Now we can use it. I'm so excited. In fact, I'm doing this presentation today, if you will, because I'm just really excited about being alive at this point. I've been focusing this past week a lot on some of the news around the censorship that's been going on throughout the world. And ultimately, I came through a window of kind of feeling stressed about it, a bit angry. And ultimately, I realized that even my own practice, which is to continually focus on bettering myself and staying in a positive vibration, it was really being challenged. So for me, going back to the topic of, my primary contribution, I think, in terms of taking back control of your health, regenerate. My intention is to infuse those who are interested with an awareness around health that goes deeper than the surface. And to me, one of the ways to do that is really to focus on the elements, which are fundamentally mysterious. There isn't a scientist on the planet that can explain fire or air or water in a sufficient way, according to my belief system. And that's why they're mysterious. That's why they are to be, revered in certain ways. There's awe that arises when you're at a campfire and you're just watching the fairy-like movements of the flame. Now we have a lot of science to explain why those wavelengths are essential to regulating our entire physiology, for example. The ancient Vedic traditions, they would look at the dawn with these beautiful red wavelengths and then sunset as being essential. In fact, it's like a immortal elixir that is delivered to us, an opportunity daily, that if we allow it to penetrate us and to reset, if you will, the circadian rhythms or the HPA axis or whatever Western anatomical or physiological structure you need to make it seem important, the truth of it is that we have, from very, very early in our, ancient past, we have been part of the cycles of nature. And these cycles are ultimately incredible. They're mysterious. They infuse us with energy. I just came from a yoga class. And during the yoga class, it was so apparent to me just how amazing it is to be embodied. And first and foremost, and this is probably my first health secret, is that intentional movement is the way in which you really start to liberate yourself from all the pain and suffering that is sort of part and parcel of living in this, called a postmodern age. And what I mean by that is that if you think about it, most of what we do is really not fully conscious. We're all master multitaskers in a certain way. We're, sort of split into fragments that can manage multiple things simultaneously. I mean, just even having a smartphone in your car while you're driving is practically a miracle that there aren't orders of magnitude more, traffic accidents, every day. We have developed abilities that are profound, but ultimately they require a splitting up and fragmentation of consciousness. So to navigate the multiple steps of being in the world today, I'm a father, I'm a business owner, I'm an activist, I'm a person that likes to socialize a lot. I manage a lot in my life, and I have to really kind of fragment myself. And when you look at your body going through these motions, ultimately, we're really not possessed in ourselves. We're dispossessed by the tasks that are required in order to navigate this modern world. Let's say we're driving. If you think about the amount of movements your body has to take to simply respond to the Newtonian mechanics of the external world so you don't crush someone or get crushed, your body isn't really owned by you, right? You're not feeling it intimately as your own visceral envelope of consciousness and or feeling. And that's really known as the phenomenological body, right? The lived body, the felt body, the visceral body, the conscious body, the body that you intend to move or do something with that you want. So you have two bodies, essentially. This is one way of breaking it down. You have the body as the object, right? That's a thing in the tangible universe. Like you could take your right hand, which is a, organ of percipience, meaning I touch something and it renders the tangible world, you know, conscious. But that hand itself is an object that I can touch with my left hand, and now it becomes a tangible object. So your body is both a subject and an object, is what I'm saying. Take any sensorial example. Your eye is physical, right? It can be injured actually if you poke it. So it's a physical thing, and yet it's the thing that makes visible the entire universe that is visible. Okay, so we live in a very paradoxical avatar, which is the body. It's an object and it's a subject, and it's reversible. That's what's interesting, isn't it? My hand, right, can be an object, it could be a tangible, or it could be that which touches things and makes the tangible world present. My eye is visible, and yet it's the thing that makes the visible world apparent to me. In fact, when you look at it through the lens of phenomenology, your eyes are actually like a cyclopean experience, right? You just have the visible world pouring through. You just have this kind of like hole in your head. And that's the miracle of embodiment. But then you look at it from the outside in and you have these two eyes. You have an optical chiasm that somehow takes the two views and makes this happen. But I guess my point here is that if you're living in the modern world, okay, and you're doing the 10,000 things you do a day with your body just to survive and respond and, ultimately create a life, how much of that is intentional? How much of you is conscious and moving intentionally and experiencing the body from the inside out? That's why yoga, as many of you know, is one of the most painful of all annoying experiences. Like I have to drag myself to yoga class, take me to like a high intensity CrossFit workout and I love it. Yeah, I injure myself sometimes because it's just full of like, you're just moving, you're transcending, it's ecstatic, at least for me. But yoga is difficult. It's because it forces you back into this body machine because it's been treated that way. And you have to start uncovering, the miracle and the technology of embodiment. So today in my yoga class, at first I'm like, I can't believe I'm at yoga. And I only went because I missed my normal high intensity group fitness class. But by the end of it, I was just reminded by the miracle that the body is and how the topic of the 5 elements fits so perfectly into yoga practice, which is many thousands of years old. It was interesting. The woman who taught it was talking about how you do a handstand for 30 seconds. It's like basically getting Botox, right? You don't need it because there's so much longevity afforded to those who do yoga. And in fact, on GreenMedInfo, you probably know that there's a ton of clinical research now showing that yogis basically look younger, they feel younger, physiologically, biologically, they age less. And in fact, they can reverse their aging, which is another exciting topic. So some of us who are drawn to the topic out of sheer mystery, it's good enough. But there's some that, it's more, maybe vanity related reasons, which is fine because ultimately we have a biological trajectory that is not set in stone. Does not go 1-in-1 with your chronological trajectory. I'm about to turn 50 and I've lived a pretty intense life, and I can't say I've always treated my body well, but I can tell you that I feel pretty young, and actually competitively with those who are much younger, I tend to have more stamina, I notice. So ultimately we are the masters of our destiny. So how do we get there? Well, I know I used a very kind of complex example about how the lived body works in relation to the body as object. But my point around that is when you do intentional movement practice, it could be walking on the beach, it could be, doing yoga, it could be taking a bike ride. If you're not doing too many things at once, because, when I cycle, I actually have a podcast on and I'm kind of thinking about other things. But if you're really focusing on your body, that's when self-ownership really comes in. And you start to understand that many of the things that feel are oppressive, symptoms that might, afflict us, like arthritis or fatigue or back issues. When you do yoga, for example, because it's really such a wholesome exercise, you start to realize things that you do. You hold postures of tension. Maybe there's a kind of catecholamine asana you do while you're working at your screen because you're stressed about what you're doing. Or maybe it's driving. You're an aggressive driver or overly defensive, and by the end of a drive, your body is like basically encased in a rigid energy. Well, what yoga does enables you to loosen that back up, take possession again of your body, and ultimately help you to access these amazing elements in a new way. So what I would propose is that there are elements that we can access within ourselves that are not reducible to conventional scientific definitions. So, when we're talking about fire, yes, it connects to things like thermal energy and heat, but the fire we're speaking of also connects to things like passion, right? Ultimately, yoga, as an example, but it could be any movement practice, requires familiarity with these elements. You have breath, for example, air. Okay, this is one way of looking at it. Excuse me. So you have fire, which could be identified with passion and feeling. You have air, which is identified with thinking. Okay. You have earth, which is identified with being grounded, which there are many variations of this. You can be so grounded that you feel, you're not even conscious. But then the other side of it, you can be so airy and dissociated from your body that, you can get into an accident, So earth is obviously very important. And when we look at nutritional practices and theories, that's a really important place to start. And that's why I spent a lot of time in Regenerate trying to talk about what I felt was an ideal diet, because there are very generic concepts of what we need, which I call the ancestral template. And then there are very individualized needs. And that's really on us all to discover. Okay, so you have air, you have fire, you have earth. There's also this amazing element. Okay, you have wind. Wind is another one. And you can go into traditions like there's Chinese and even Vedic, where you have this like principle that might cause a little bit of uncertainty, randomness. It can actually be a type of affliction in ways. You also have ether. And to me, this is the primary, I wouldn't even really call it an element, because for me, ether is like the quantum vacuum, right? Within quantum physics. It's like this underlying fabric of not just energy, but information that is so, it has so much to offer that if you were to try to describe the amount of energy, right, that is contained within, let's say, a cup of water, according to Richard Feynman, it has enough energy to burn all the oceans of the world off into steam. That underlying jiggle, the smallest measurement possible, right, is this quantum of action, expresses so much energy and, again, information that it overwhelms our conventional experience, like of macroscopic objects interacting with each other. An example is the body. We think the body is this machine that needs fuel, like a car, so it can go from A to B. But when you really look at the way, for example, the little nanomotor within mitochondria called the ATPase, which produces ATP, right? One of the things that comes out of this, it's rotating so fast that if you were trying to account for the energy expressed in, I think it could be something crazy like 60,000 rotations a second or something like this. There's just no way to account for that energy. Okay. It's not because you ate a hamburger and it was broken down into calories and that somehow, is accounting for the trillions and trillions of these nanomotors moving at, what to us is a near infinite speed, or the fact that the electromagnetic field potential of a single mitochondrion is about the same as a lightning bolt, and there are trillions of those in our body. There's no way we can account for the body as a machine as a way to explain the near infinite amount of energy that is available to our body to function. So what I've come to understand is that, for example, when it comes to the Krebs cycle, for example, right, that supposedly is driving the energy or carrying the energy within mitochondria, it's really more about producing biomass. When we're talking about, the cellular bioenergetics, it's the most obvious problem is that the body has so much energy available to itself that you can't account for it from external physical sources. It's as if it's a conducting mechanism. The idea, for example, that the sun is just a nuclear fission, machine, basically, versus it is like in the lightning bolt view. There's a great documentary on the electromagnetic universe that shows it's conducting energy. It could be like a Tesla coil, where there's this amazing energy available, but we're not really, we're transducing it. So from the quantum vacuum, that's what ether is ultimately. Ether is an all-pervading energy and intelligence that we can access, and we do access, and yet we don't know it. In fact, my understanding of ether is it is the foundation for all the other elements, that we participate in indirectly by, for example, eating food. The energy we're getting from food isn't just reducible to the chemical backbone. This has been made clear in the case of, for example, vitamin C, where the Nobel Prize winner, who was in like 1929, received the Nobel Prize for discovering ascorbic acid, Sven Georgi. I'm probably not pronouncing his name correctly, but he made it clear in his Nobel laureate talk when he won the prize that he was able to cure his friend of scurvy-related symptoms from giving him paprika. Ascorbic acid did not do the trick because paprika has vitamin C activity, but it's not reducible to a simple chemical. And so it's similar when we're talking about food. Food can contain prana. It can contain elements of ether, right? Information, energy, intelligence, even compassion, but it's not what it appears, okay? The body is not a machine. We're not throwing fuel in the hopper. I started off actually in Regenerate talking about, food as information. And that is true because it puts form into things. But when I went deeper into understanding ether, which again came up in the book, because I was trying to understand how the heck does a pistol shrimp strike its claw in water and then produce temperatures similar to what's found on the surface of the sun? How is that possible? Where's the energy coming from? We're talking about a little shrimp, a couple inches long, okay, that can break a diver's thumb in half or break through aquarium glass with this strike. Where's the energy coming from? Well, it's because of the transduction of this near infinite amount of energy that exists in any point in space and time that it is able to accomplish this near impossible feat. A lot of the cold fusion research now is looking at these examples. So it's super exciting to me because I found out about this by looking into how mitochondria have so much energy. How is it possible? And of course, I ran into this amazing Army researcher's work who was trying to see whether or not Luis Kevran's work was correct. This is the author of a number of papers and a book on biotransmutation of elements, right? How is it that cows, for example, are eating green grass all day, which is super rich in magnesium, and they are producing way more calcium than they're consuming in their diet? Isn't it true that if they're producing more calcium than magnesium, then it has to come from somewhere? Well, if it's not from their diet, where is it coming from? Well, Luis Kevran noted a number of examples of where animals, were transmuting these atoms into one another, right? So magnesium into calcium, right? Or potassium into sodium, or vice versa. Another example was in some of the hottest places in the sub-Sahara desert, workers, they're working in 130 degree heat, are consuming salt tablets in order to lower their temperature. You'd think that they would want something rich in potassium, right? Like maybe some fruit juice, but salt was used. And when he measured their urine and excreta, he found that they were giving off way more potassium than sodium. So somehow, through what is known as low energy nuclear transformation of sodium into magnesium. They were converting it. And he looked at other examples throughout, naturalistic observations, was almost 200 years of observation. There are examples of animals converting elements into one another. So basically, he didn't have the exact mechanism worked out, but it was this army researcher that I talk about in my book, that discovered that mitochondria apparently have a way of converting through magnesium ATP the elements into one another. So basically, according to his proposition, the way the ATP magnesium ATP is stacked, it's like a helix, and protons, are being accelerated through this helix at near a speed of light, or several 100,000 miles per second, so that they're basically creating a collision, converting these atoms into one another. And this is, according to that research, similar to how a cyclotron particle accelerator works. So he had us worked out the mechanism by which basically the body is converting light into programmable matter. That's the way that Dr. Cruz talks about it, Jack Cruz. Only other person I've ever read having discussed the way in which mitochondria might accomplish this feat. So, in other words, the body is somehow taking the near limitless amount of energy and information, because it's not just energy, it's very specific and guided. And this is why quantum biology is such an exciting new field, using this in order to accomplish what modern chemistry and physics and nutrition says is impossible, and yet it's happening every single moment in our body. So ultimately, in looking at what is known as 0-point energy or the quantum vacuum, I started to see that some of these researchers were talking about this as being ether. And ether is that missing element, the element that, as far as I understand, also connects to what is known as the Akash, which is a term that individuals like Gandhi used, Rudolf Steiner, Edgar Cayce. And it refers to a concept that I think we can relate to these days because of the emergence of the blockchain. And basically, blockchain is like a truth machine. Okay, when we talk about it through the lens of finance, it becomes basically like betting and Ponzi schemes. And there's truth to that. A lot of these projects are garbage, and they're basically a way to make a promise through a white paper or gray paper that they're going to deliver on some solution for society or fintech. And then they get all this money, they award themselves pre-coin, ICO pre-coin, and then they end up, not doing anything. So unfortunately, the space is pretty corrupt, and it's basically gambling. But you do have projects like Cordal, which I've been doing a number of interviews with the founders, and we'll be doing another one soon, because ultimately what they're providing is a decentralized way to record the truth and even enable us on our devices to independently of this global internet system that can be shut down, or access can be limited to everyone that's on this broadcast, and creating a workaround that. So that blockchain, right, is a way to establish an unbreakable, unmanipulatable, permissionless, trustless way to take information of things that actually happened, right? Not things that have been manipulated or distorted or edited, so we only get one view of things, but to host the truth finally. So interestingly, the concept behind the Akash, which connects actually in Gandhi's writing on to sky, it's like air, again, it's like ether, is that we have access to a limitless amount of information. Now, this is going to be hard for some people to believe or understand, and I totally empathize with you because I'm still trying to figure it out. But in the concept of the Akash, there is future timelines and events, as well as past timeline and events converge, or it transcends the normal linearity, of Euclidean, Cartesian, Newtonian space-time. So it unfolds multiple versions of reality, and or like a multiverse concept, not the, again, tech version, but reality. There are multiple timelines. For example, if I've lived a life where I've done things that I regret and ultimately never come to redeem myself, meaning convert the lead of that garbage of karma or bad decision making into the gold of, I learned the lesson, my heart is now more open, and guess what? Next time I'm presented that challenge, I'm going to make a better decision. Then if we haven't done that work, then yeah, it looks like in many ways we're living a karmic life and our destiny is predetermined and it's pretty predictable as far as where we're going to end up, right? Probably not in a good place. But there are ways in which your past and even past lives where we had to learn hard lessons can be learned from, and then that those lessons and hard experiences become gifts that enable us to call in future timelines that are extremely positive, and so that's the beauty of looking at time, space, and even our own lives through a different lens, is that we all collectively can call in an incredible, beautiful world together. And I've been speaking about this lately, about some of the discoveries in water cavitation, which, you can give credit to people like Mark LeClaire, and also these little animals that utilize cavitation. So it's not like this hasn't always existed. But the technology, the implications, which I believe ancient pre-major cataclysm civilizations from which we came, but we've long forgotten due to trauma and amnesia, had access to these technologies, many of which are related to the types of powers that I'm trying to articulate in sort of as best scientific way as possible. What I mean by that is that cymatics, for example, like we have power in our voice that is unimaginable. When you do mantra, for example, or actually just take the example of an opera singer who can break a glass. Okay, that's a really good physical example that, yes, the voice has profound power. Or you look at ultrasound technology. It's a type of sound frequency that's used to look at fetuses in the womb. Well, we've discovered recently that one reason why autism rates have shot up so highly is because ultrasound induces cavitation within the fetus, which is like little micronuclear bombs going off in their tissue. So it's not just vaccination that's contributed to the scaling of autism. It's unfortunately things like ultrasound. Ultrasound can happen even through a whisper. There's certain frequencies that can induce cavitation. So it's interesting, like how we know poetically, and in your life, you could say something to someone who's vulnerable, who loves you, that could wreck their world, or you could say something to them that would change the trajectory of their life and open their heart and cause profound healing. So that's a good example of what we know about soul to soul interactions. But there is a physical aspect to this that is actually scientifically validated. My colleague, John Stewart Reed, helped me understand some of the lore around mantra when it comes to yogis claiming that a mantra can literally send its energy around the entire universe. And what he helped me understand is that when you have sound, you're basically causing collisions, right, of these various air molecules, for example, or atoms, and that they create infrared and then actually emit photons. So when we speak, we're actually producing light. And light, as we know, travels, 186,000 miles per second. And that's just the particle version. The waveform, actually, through quantum entanglement, is able to connect to the universe. Like, so we're you get down to the quantum level and you're like, okay, anything's possible. We are connected to literally anything. But when we're talking about cymatics, it's very powerful. And ultimately, what I'm trying to articulate here is that, I know this is going all over the place, but I think it's important to just document some of this, is that when you look at the development of the internet today and the blockchain, what you're seeing is an externalization of what is accessible to us through the most profound technology that exists, which is you close your eyes and exist in this incredible, interstellar, immortal vessel. And so when I say that, This is not gobbledygook. This is science. This is the most fundamental science, is that, the inspiration behind Regenerate was you have the last universal common ancestor cell from which all living things on the planet came from. Okay. It's just a fact of our biology. And that there are immortal cells that have been replicating for an infinite amount of time that come from the first cell that was planted on the planet. Now, the question is really around, and this is fascinating to me, where did the first biopolymer come from that replicates? Now, the assumption has always been in the ancient oceans, right? Because of hydrothermal vents. Hydrothermal vents actually have the ability to produce biopolymers. And a recent convergence of studies from Mark Leclerc's work that shows that through the Leclerc effect, when you cavitate water using a laser, it could happen mechanically through a propeller on a ship. It causes an exotic water bubble to form that produces a reentrant jet that hits relativistic speeds, crashes against the nearest physical, resistance point, and creates a crystal, a fifth phase of water. It's a hexagonal water crystal that actually has a helical form. In fact, it even inscribes the helical form on the plate, that then it produces an ore, which includes diamond and platinum and all the elements on the periodic chart. I mean, this is like a crazy supernova-like event happening from water. Pretty much could be induced through accidents or through any way to produce that cavitation, acoustically, through laser, through mechanically. That hexagonal water crystal is a template for RNA and DNA. In a recent study, I just Googled, okay, I'm sorry I Googled, I know, that's pretty shameful. I just assume they're watching me with whatever I do. I think that's legitimate. So is that there is new studies showing that water cavitation induces prebiotic nucleosides. So before life existed, the nucleoside building block to contain the information that we know is a genetic code was induced through water cavitation. So finally, when you put in the hydrothermal vents, the work of Mark Leclerc, and this new research on cavitation-induced nucleoside formation, it's clear that if there was no biopolymer coming from a meteor containing probably a fungal cell as the origin of the first cell on this planet, which is, again, the last universal common ancestor, Luca, approximately 3.4 billion years ago, it's that it either was de novo synthesis, which is interesting when you consider the work of Luc Montagnier, who again received the Nobel Prize for discovering the HIV particle, who later did a study published in Nature that showed that DNA teleportation was possible, that you were able to basically send a wave form from one point in space to another, which enabled the reassembly of a biopolymer pretty much out of its constituent parts. So life was able, the template for life, the informational template, can be sent invisibly through a wave form in a distant, place in space-time. Meaning there could have been an interstellar communication of a waveform to terraform our planet. Okay, so this science fiction stuff isn't science fiction anymore. I think one of the people that first commented on his research finding said that he's either, this is the most amazing study of all time, or he should be put in the loony bin, because that's how science works, right? You're either freaking crazy or you're celebrated as a genius. But if what you find threatens the paradigms of control, then unfortunately, often the information gets squashed. So I know this is going really esoteric and academic in ways, and you may be wanting very practical insight, and I will try to deliver that near the end of this. But I do want to share some of these things. So when it comes to these findings, so what I'm trying to articulate here is that life can emerge de novo out of so-called nothing. So it's not necessary to propose, as I often believed, for actually decades, that we have to know where that first biopolymer formed. Was it a lightning strike in the ocean? Was it water cavitation induced synthesis of a prebiotic nucleoside? You don't even need that, because the ether enables the formation of three-dimensional things out of itself. So it's almost like the concept of spontaneous generation. Or look at miraculous remission of things like cancers. I have a dear friend who I visited just 2 days ago who prayed to her creator that a cancer that has afflicted her for 4 years, and she's tried everything on the planet, it's nearly killed her, be removed from her body. She finally said, I've tried everything, God, please help me. And so what happened is that she had an experience in the plane, actually, on the way down to Florida, where that tumor literally left her body. It was a bloody affair, but it was a miracle. And it happened because she believed it possible and she asked for support. That is an example, okay, of something disappearing. Now you look at Ming Tung's work from the Medicineless College in China, and he showed me a video of them performing a Qigong ritual involving mantra with a CT scan verification of a tumor of a patient being dissolved in real time within a matter of a few minutes. How is that possible, right? Well, the formation of things out of the quantum vacuum or ether can happen, as well as the disappearance. And when you think about it, and this has always been my fundamental insight about being alive, is that none of this should exist. I mean, if we really grasp the mystery, none of this should exist. Why wouldn't the universe just not exist, right? That's what the existentialists have always been having their hard time about, right? Is like, why be so freaking evil to create a universe full of suffering when it didn't have to exist? This whole thing is exploding each moment out of the void and creating itself, this infinite thing that we're part of. So why wouldn't the body participate in that? Well, because of the patterns and the forms and the mind structures that hold this illusion into place. And so that is a lot of responsibility and power that the human holds. So going back, trying to find a way to really ground this. So I believe we exist in a moment of time where ancient powers, are coming back into our field of awareness that were once believed to be the sole possession of what we call the gods, that humans are these sovereign beings that exist in a interstellar capable body, that if we were to dive deeper into quantum mechanics and all that's been rendered possible, we would understand why some shamans have been believed or noted or observed to walk through walls. That sounds crazy to some people, so I understand that. And the point is not to say that humans are gods and we're all powerful and that we don't need to be humble and and to acknowledge that there are absolutely forces at play that could crush us if we're not careful. And obviously, that's been part of my experience of being an activist, actually. That said, the truth is the truth. And I'm sorry to say, because some of this will probably upset people, that humans have a near infinite power to determine their destiny. Now, I came up with that through my work on health, but now I'm starting to better understand psychologically the implications. If we were to liberate ourselves fully to our true sovereignty and our connection to the divine, things are possible on this planet that I don't think most people could even imagine. I'm saying that there is a possibility that humanity could enter into a phase where aspirationally the only thing that we care about is whether or not our fellow loved ones and sentient beings are happy, healthy, and connected to source. That this is something that is possible. And I believe it did happen in past ages. And they were so enlightened, you could even use the phrase Lemuria to describe the so-called, civilization and continent, that was how they lived. And I think there's still threads of that have been preserved. We all know those individuals in our lives who are angelic, who have dedicated themselves to service, that are suffused with a divine energy. They're not suffering. And yet, we can't imagine how we would sacrifice or change our lives to do anything close to what they're doing in terms of service. So I think that that's part of what is coming up for us. And, as I envision what's possible, it makes me super excited because if we believe that we can heal, okay, starting back with just this advocacy around physical health, then that is the first step in healing. And the limitation that I've noted for myself and others is that we don't feel we deserve it. So that's another big issue, which is psychological, psychospiritual. Why is it do we believe that we don't deserve that? Maybe we were raised with parents that got angry at us for just existing, right? And maybe they had religious structures that repeated that traumatic, punitive cycle. And maybe that's because in the history of our species, we've gone through cataclysms where it has seemed arbitrarily from the skies, we were punished by, meteors or comets that ultimately wiped us clean, like wiped us out, basically, reducing us to, sheer animality in terms of having to survive. And again, someone got really upset at me because I use that phrase, because animals are divine, and I agree, but put them in a position of being tortured or deprived of what they need, which is what the whole rat park study showed. You compress a bunch of animals into tight spaces and treat them like we do ourselves in cities, and they're terrible to one another. So, but you give them the right space to enjoy, their environment, each other, and they don't even want cocaine. The same is true for humans. But what I'm trying to point out is that if we look at the DNA of our soul and we understand that at a species-wide level, cataclysm was built into being on this planet. And in fact, there are cycles that we now understand that probably participate in this recurring theme of having to deal with meteor impacts. In fact, my recent research into the pyramids showed that those were basically arks, that they knew there would be periodic cycles where the earth would have to be faced with cataclysm, and they preserved all the knowledge possible within those structures, and they were able to survive cataclysm. So they're not just tombs, right? They weren't actually ever tombs. There was never a body ever found inside one. But so going back to this crazy presentation of mine, my understanding is that trauma is actually at the root of why we don't fully heal. Because first of all, we don't believe we deserve to heal ultimately. We've been programmed through many, many generations of trauma to believe that we don't have any of these powers, right? We don't even witness our own body heal in a way where we can appreciate the miracle and the power of incarnation, or we don't know the science well enough to understand that, yeah, there are immortal cells within us, and they do go awry in the case of cancer. But that's because of the epigenetic environment, right? The tumor microenvironment is off. The psychological environment is off. So when we clear ourselves of those limitations and wrongful beliefs, we are delivered back into the miracle of existence. And that's where we tap into the ether. So the ether, as far as I understand it, it's just not this thing this magical thing that you want to extract. It's like the question around what is quality. My favorite of all writers in American philosophy is Robert Pirsig, who wrote Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Had I not read that book, I wouldn't have become a philosophy major. That's how impactful it was for me. And it's written almost like fiction. And some of it is probably fiction. But what he tried to do, especially in his sequel, Lila, A Metaphysics of Value, was try to understand basic questions. Like what makes, high quality USDA meat more high quality, or what is quality, basically? What is this value, this thing that we prize, that we think is good, that we compare everything to, or we strive to attain? And when you start to go deeper down that rabbit hole, you start to understand that's actually what we're talking about. It's not, this quantum vacuum of just endless information and energy. Is there intention there? Is there compassion built into that? I know it sounds really mysterious, but what I'm trying to point out is that when we do things that are good for ourselves and others, there's something that is delivered. I don't know, call it a gift, call it grace, call it a reward, but we end up accessing a type of life energy that infuses us and can affect all the other elements, okay? That can reignite passion in your life, that can regenerate your bones, right? Or cause your body to reform where your biological age is reversed. I love the example of this Italian study where these women were tracked when they stopped smoking. Okay. They chose to do something good. They stopped smoking. Within 9 months, their biological age reversed 13 years. Who doesn't want that? Was it just because smoke has all this bad stuff in it? No, there are examples of those who smoked every day of their life, drank rum, and they lived to be 110 and were happy. It's just that there was an intentionality around that as well. Yes, smoking is full of pro-oxidant effects that can accelerate damage to the body, but it's not absolute. There's always an anomaly to disprove the theory that we think is applicable to everything. So in the case of this good act, they reverse their age 13 years. Now, we can look at many things we do in our life and we can look at how we do it. And to me, that's the most important thing. It's what is the intention? Am I doing it because I'm afraid? Am I doing it because I feel like I'd be punished or wouldn't be rewarded if I didn't do it? Am I doing it out of the goodness of my heart? What is the intention? How am I doing it? What is the style of being that you bring into the things that you do? I've often noted that when people do anything, you can look at the way they do it, right? The style, and you can pick up everything about who they are. Back in the day when I was really looking at the problem with gluten and just how incredibly addictive it is, and in a way kind of almost like grossly sensual, right? People would eat their pizza and the way that they would eat it would be so reflective of how they have a relationship intimately with others. And it was sometimes gross to watch. Sometimes it was like you didn't. My point is that the style of being that we have and how we do things is actually part of the mystery of how we access this supposed mysterious substance called ether that we probably all want, because it does have a promise of longevity and of happiness and of being connected to source in such a way that we can regenerate. It's a big part of why I wrote Regenerate, is I wanted to understand the mystery. Like, how is it the case that even in my own medical history, where I don't feel I should be here, my body just keeps coming back, that I'm able to wake up every day with gratitude that I still exist. And I think it has to do with intentionality, and it has to do with checking your ego and ultimately taking full responsibility for one's life. So, I went through a period where I was really feeling a victim. I was like, man, like I'm having a lot of issues with my hip. And I look at my medical history, how these, evil doctors, took me when I was in Germany. I went to kindergarten there. I didn't even speak German. And I literally ended up getting treated at a hospital in Dortmund where the director was the former head of the Nazis' medical institution, sort of like the head of what the FDA would be. And I remember being carted in, and they were injecting me and these other children with who knows what, and they were screaming out "Polizei, Polizei," like the police. Like we felt like victims. Like I was literally tortured. Now, in retrospect, I look back and I'm like, you know what? Maybe this was what I needed to learn, because in past incarnations, I was on the other side of this, and once I started to consider that possibility, that I needed to experience that suffering so I could connect with the suffering of others, because we are all one. Like there's nothing that a human is experiencing on this planet that doesn't affect me, whether I like it or not. I mean, that is one of the realizations I came to in the past few years, in my heart, was that if we are all one, and yeah, many humans have gone astray, and yes, there have probably been some tinkering with bloodlines and some non-human energy being put into certain individuals. It doesn't really matter so much if we're being human and we're not letting ourselves get captured by the hatred and fear and division. Then ultimately, we are living, in congruence. We're living in a way that will help others raise up and redeem themselves, give themselves an opportunity. When I worked as a counselor of children, right, I was a teacher counselor for troubled children, working in the wilderness therapy setting since I was in college, all the way up until my professional career. And I ultimately experienced the reality, which is that children and adults, because we're all still children inside, whether we want to admit it or not, we live up and down to expectations. So, when you respond to someone and you think little of them, or you think the worst possible thing versus being compassionate and realize, wow, they must be in pain to do something so messed up, then they tend to live up or down to that. So that was another thing that I discovered. It's kind of hard to experience someone or something as evil when you're looking at their sheer humanness, right? Their abject humanity, and imagine a bit about their own trauma history. So I think there is something to this, is that ether is available to those who walk with a path of goodness, where you're actually acknowledging that forgiveness is something that ultimately we all deserve. I mean, if you don't think that you deserve forgiveness, you're not going to give someone else that, right? So I think that's where we have to look within more than ever. There's so many reasons to get upset at the world, right? To let our physiology take us on a wild ride and then feel like victims when we have to experience the consequences of it. I was thinking about that today in my yoga class. I'm like, how much time do we spend glued to a machine trying to connect to the universe when in fact we need to close our eyes and connect directly to the Akashic, or correctly and directly to the source energy within us, and start to breathe and like feel embodiment, connecting to the earth, like experiencing the elements. When you're dealing with artificial light the way we are, I mean, at least I try to put the night shift on my phone, and I use Flux or Iris software to help to get the red wavelengths back on the screen. But when we attach ourselves to the grid, right, which in Florida, there's nuclear reactors, Fukushima style, powering the energy that's going into my brain, infusing my being with what? If I go look at the news aggregator, all I'm getting is their psyop trying to focus my attention on things of fear, scarcity, division, and ultimately I'm plugging myself into the matrix, is what I'm saying. So if we're not taking the time, to get off of our devices and connect to reality, which is again available to us all, then ultimately we are going to end up, delaying a timeline that can be exceedingly beautiful for ourselves and future generations. So I think that's a big part of what I'm saying here, guys, is that to connect to the elements is literally it's a mandate to get off of the devices. I know it's ironic because we're using them to communicate this. Put your bare feet on the ground. Take the opportunity to have a limitless stream of negative electrons specifically, that are antioxidant and that can actually heal your membranes and infuse your body with energy. That's what we need to do, is to put our bare feet on the ground. And when we start to do that, we connect back to ether, because good luck getting that through a computer screen. It's all within your own amazing technology. Or start eating food, right, that has a high vibration and that contains a rainbow of wavelengths. Like when you think about it, you eat a rainbow of food and then it comes out you as soil. Where did the colors go? And why is that important? If you're eating synthetic foods with synthetic colors that are from petrochemicals, you can imagine what that does. It distorts your soul. It contributes to cancer and every disease we know. So it's all about using very logical principles ultimately to connect back to the elements. Air is available, but we have to make sure the air is clean. Like ultimately, I'm fortunate I get to live on the beach where I get the air from the Atlantic. And so I can open my doors and I can actually just let that energy permeate me. But if I'm not consciously breathing, allowing that in, then ultimately, again, my body becomes this like machine. It becomes part of the matrix. And then, of course, when it comes to ether, it's about intentionality. It's about allowing yourself to connect to your true nature and to really give yourself permission, because, based on my work around the nocebo and placebo effect, it's never been clearer to me that what you believe is the rate limiting step for what's possible with your health, with your relationships, with your prosperity. And so that is a reflection of just how much power we have and how disempowered we are. Okay. So it's all really up to us ultimately. And that's what, coming into one's sovereignty is about, is that realizing that we are constantly breathing our prana into the agendas and devices and distractions and the vampirism of others. Like, we have the right and the responsibility to take full control of where we put our life energy. There's another way of looking at it too. Like, a lot of people like to cord with the earth, right? And like extract energy from mother. And you know what? She's here to provide that to us, okay, under certain agreements, right? There's certain things you have to do. Like, for example, you do want to give back. Otherwise, you're not just going to get an endless free ride. But there's another way of looking at it, is the ether is actually available anywhere in the universe. And it's a way of not dependently attaching to this mother-child dyad, but accessing a type of energy that I really feel is being made available to us because of where we stand in the great year cycle. This is a fun thing to kind of close off with, even though I know I didn't give you a ton of practical examples, but if you want those, they're in Regenerate. I mean, I spent a lot of time even on a whole chapter on what you should or shouldn't eat, which is what people want. But when it comes to the cycle that we're in, I just want to go over this because in my keynote talk at the Faena a few weekends ago, I was sort of compressed. There was a time constraint and it didn't feel right, because this topic deserves a lot of attention, which is we are on the earth, okay? It rotates back on its axis in a clockwise, counterclockwise fashion, right? Every 24 hours, which generates the illusion, right? That things rise in the east and they set in the west. So that clockwise motion is created because the earth rotates backward on its axis. And then you have the reality, right? Hopefully some of us have come to this understanding that, we have a solar system set up where there is this thing called the sun in the middle, and we go around the sun, right, in this yearly cycle. And so that establishes the basic mechanics of the solar system, right, and how we interact with the sun. But what most people don't realize is that there is a third motion, which is that the sun itself is part of a binary star system that has its own cycle, where basically over the course of about 24 to 26,000 years, these two stars interact with each other such that they come closer to each other and then they go away. And it's about a 26,000 year cycle. So there's what's called the barycenter, where they basically come together and then they go out. And we're at the point now where we just reached like a maximum distance, and we're now coming into proximity and acceleration of this sort of like reunion. And that was done by Walter Cruttenden, if I'm pronouncing his name right. I don't think I am. It's called The Lost Star of Myth and Time. It's the most incredible book. And it discusses how this was inspired by the Vedic seers, right? That this binary star system has been known for quite some time. And as we approach this convergence point, we start entering into what's known a golden age. And it's a golden age of consciousness as well, where the etheric element, ether, right, versus you talk about the iron age that preceded, right? You think of iron, you think of earth, you think grounded, it's heavy, it brings consciousness down, you think of war and mechanics. The golden age is really about ascension into our subtler bodies, and that's the thing, is that there's nothing more scientific that I can think of observationally than you close your eyes, you're dreaming, and you have vivid images, right? Where is that coming from, right? Well, because you have other bodies, some of which don't depend on the physical flesh. That's why we have a soul, right? What was that phrase? We don't have a soul. We are a soul. We have a body. That's a really profound inversion. So when you go deeper down the rabbit hole and look at what subtle bodies are and what we truly are, so when you start tapping into your oversoul or your highest self, it's so profoundly more expansive, intelligent, loving, and capable that it makes this, little avatar of ourselves interacting right now look like so small, like a little shrimp, basically, relative to what we're capable of when we are liberated from that mortal coil, if you will. So as we enter this golden age, what's happening is that we have available to us energies that were not available to, our distant ancestors. There's more ether, if you will, available to feed the etheric body, to provide the medium within which the soul recognizes itself as immortal and capable of connecting in ways that even this technology would seem to be child's play. So, in other words, telepathy or being able to feel someone else's presence, like all these technologies we have through the internet have created this familiarity. Like you can ping someone anywhere on the planet with an electron with these various communication devices, and this is normal for us now, right? This would have been considered crazy sci-fi. Or right now in real time, I can project myself around the world. That's pretty crazy. But imagine that doing that without the technology. That is what is coming up. And I believe that if you look at the work of Julian Jaynes and the breakdown of the bicameral mind, what is it? The birth of consciousness through the breakdown of the bicameral mind. He's a Princeton professor that proposed that back in, say, Greco-Roman times, we lived in a totally different type of consciousness embodiment where the self was even acknowledged to live here. We weren't behind the eyes and the brain. That's like we live in a totally different experience of embodiment and selfhood now than we did just a few thousand years ago. And that's true as we evolve. Teilhard de Chardin, the priest and biologist, talked about the omega point and how teleogenically all the bodies on the planet, there would be a population density issue that would occur around now that would force an involution of consciousness. We'd be locked into our little bodies compressed in space, and we would have to go inward in order to discover our true nature and ultimately connect at the heart level. So this was for him like what Christogenesis or the omega point would be reached. So that's kind of what's coming up, guys, is that, we have this amazing transitional device that was birthed by the military, basically, which is the internet, that provided this connectivity so that we could all start synchronizing. And when I say all, I mean that some of us, people on this broadcast, we have certain values and experiences that are resonating with each other. And we're creating a field and we're holding a certain vision of what's possible. That is beautiful. That is far more beautiful, right, than most people will ever imagine because they're tapped into, the mainstream media matrix. But when we hold these visions and we interact with each other with this in mind, it actually brings into existence that world that we want to live in. That is more beautiful. That is more loving. That is more prosperous. That has truth. As you don't get crucified because you've spoken a fact, right? You actually get celebrated, or it's just like, okay, it's a fact. Let's move on. Let's do something more beautiful. Like that's why Unite was created. That's why a lot of you out there are doing your own work with this. So that's the beauty of this moment is that and by the way, that star that is the most likely candidate is the brightest star in the sky. Well, of course, that's Sirius. And when you start looking into how the Dogon knew that we came from there, essentially, and they knew about Sirius A, B, and C and their interactivity, it starts to blow your mind. And you start to look at other really interesting facts around how there was an observation several years ago that when Sirius B, which is super dense, right? It's, I think, 50,000 times more dense than our own star, I believe, interacted. It's a 50, I think, year cycle of Sirius A and B interacting with each other. But it reached a certain point where it got into like the line of sight between the Earth and Sirius A, and it caused the rotation of our planet to slow down. I think it was like a second. So that proved that distant body is capable of affecting even our planetary rotation. And so if it's true that it's coming closer to us, which is this conventional astronomy that's showing this, and it's blue, by the way, it used to be red because as we were moving away from it due to the different types of wavelengths that occur, it was actually a red star. Then that's pretty freaking amazing, that this stuff actually starts to make sense. And although, some people identify this as new agey stuff, this is actually astrophysics, and the Binary Star Institute has accumulated all this amazing research because the primary explanation, for the backward rotation of the Earth through, this sort of 26,000 year precession cycle, is that the moon and the sun are having gravitational effects on the earth, and it's just something that's happening in our solar system locally. But that does not work because it takes 4,000 different mathematical variables you have to adjust to account for this anomaly. So it's like they've created this elaborate superstructure of mathematical formulas to try to explain something that could be explained very easily if our sun was partnered with another star, which is how most stars in the known universe exist. They exist in binary or triune and even quaternary systems. So we would be an exception if we just had a sun that didn't have a binary. So that's freaking exciting. Like, I was like listening to this stuff and really trying to dig into it, and I was like, this is like another Copernican revolution. It turns on its head so many assumptions and helps to explain really profound things. One of which is that if it's true that this binary star system will affect the asteroid belt, right, then it will probably dislocate some of those asteroids and comets, and then that will affect the Earth adversely. Now, theoretically, by that point in time, some of the nuclear armaments and technologies that have been developed, because even Tesla had a device that he could apply to a building, a handheld device that could have caused it to crash. And let's not get into 9/11, but let's just say directed energy weapons and thermite residues were all over the fingerprint of that event. So the reality is that we have technologies that could help us to avert collision with these known objects that are part of this 26,000 year cycle. And so this to me was a real revelation, because I am the last person that wants to get on board with some globalist agenda, right? But if you think about it, if we could utilize technologies like water cavitation to decentralize power, where water is the only thing you need, not only to power everything cleanly, but then, of course, produce the materials needed for all the devices we love and all the things we need, then that's amazing. But why not utilize some of the technology to help produce a, if you will, force field that will protect us during the next cataclysm? If we can work out all of our differences in such a way that we're all evolving spiritually to be able to handle these technologies and utilize them in a way that would benefit Gaia, that's a pretty cool vision, actually. How to get there, good luck. We all know about co-option and subversion and false promises of unity, when the real agenda is to divide and enslave. So I'm not saying I have the answer, but I know the technology exists. I feel like I better see what the cycles are, these grand cycles, and I would love for there to be a future for my children and your children and their offspring on this planet that is far more beautiful than anything that's happened previously. So I do think that when we really look at this moment, I mean, it is so amazing. This is not just a repeat of some cycle. The Earth has never had this experience before. Like, we are all evolving in a solar system, in a galaxy, among many galaxies, and there is an opportunity here on Earth that is incredible. So I think that while the talk was supposed to be more focused, I guess, on giving you instruction on basic nutrition, if there are any people here still on the talk, they're like, this guy's crazy, congratulations, because this is really what ignites me. I want to be able to share the things that bring passion into my life, that I feel will give the Earth a fighting chance, for getting through this transition. This is one of the hardest times, I think, that we've ever had politically. Never before have we had, I believe, the type of global interconnectivity through these devices. So, we're all welded together in our destiny. So my hope is that we can continue to use this platform to inspire and to invite you to come on board and start sharing your gifts, your wisdom, and we can create really an alternative to, the unfortunately compromised big tech stack. I'm very happy to say that we are seeing an incredible sea change politically. The recent lawsuit that was filed here in the Texas court will go to the Supreme Court. And it basically is holding accountable big tech platforms for acting as publishers, violating the First Amendment right, but then claiming that that is why they should be able to censor, because they have a First Amendment right as these vampiristic, soulless, immortal, corporate entities that have personhood. That's a whole nother issue that eventually we'll have to face as a collective, is that these corporations can be serial killers, accused of multiple felonies, paying out tens of billions of dollars in punishments, and they can continue to kill. And that's their business practice, right? Pharma basically used that as their business model. God bless Dr. McCullough for many years shedding light on this. They would literally build into their marketing agenda billions of dollars of anticipated punishment for intentionally killing, their customers. And somehow they have arisen as transnational corporations to have far more power than any sovereign nation or any leader within those sovereign nations. And that's why they were able to, architect the takeover of media in such a way that we ended up with a planetary lockdown under the auspices that there was the deadliest of particles, that they cared so much about all of us that they wanted to make sure we were safe. So we were locked in our homes. That's what happened. Isn't that incredible? And I do see it as an opportunity for, the great revelation around, all the veils being lifted, being able to see clearly that, how this works. And now we have an opportunity, all of us, if we don't like the fact that we're all a product and we're all, forced into servitude and enslavement to some degree by the system, then we can build it ourselves. And that's going to require that we all participate and we put our money where our mouths are. I mean, I put everything that we had with GreenMedInfo into Unite, and it's going to depend on whether, people like yourselves and others that are, wanting to create this new world actually participate, take a risk. So I'm really hoping that happens, because without diverse sources of information on the internet, obviously, I'm afraid that when the next declaration by, say an entity like the World Health Organization, that there is a deadly new variant, we are going to see a repeat, unfortunately, of what we just saw. And I think what's happening is that there are enough voices speaking up, and there is now a massive grassroots effort. I mean, what we've seen with Stand for Health Freedom has been mind-blowing. Like, the amount of support that exists is incredible for holding accountable our, elected officials and lawmakers, very simply and very peacefully and reasonably, with the facts. Hey guys, let's look at what happened and let's make better choices. And it's actually working. So we're here together to do this. I so appreciate you being on board.